fellow sculptor that follows my blog wrote me yesterday or the day before, and she asked me about my thought process when I create something. A lot of it has to do with just something that might have been mulling over my mind for several years. Or it could be from photographs that I've taken of Indian models. It could be just half a dozen of several different reasons for doing something. It's whatever moves me. I've had people that have commissioned me to do something. There's a piece called Colleen, and some close friends of mine asked me to do that of their daughter and the baby that she had just had, and young daughter. Anyway, I don't like doing cute statues, and that was a subject matter that seemed cute to me. You know, a pioneer woman and a little baby and stuff like that. It took me close to 6 years to finally formulate an approach to doing that piece, and the first try at doing Colleen was actually this next one, which is called Prairie Wind, and it's a little bit smaller than what Colleen is, but it was of a woman standing on the prairie with the wind blowing from behind her, and she had just arrived at their homestead after spending several months on the trail in wagons and eating dust and mud and cold and Indians and everything else that you could possibly imagine along the trail, you know, snakes, dangerous animals, whatever. When they finally get to their spot where they're going to have their home, their soddy built, they're just getting ready to lay out where they're going to put the soddy. The woman stands there with the wind blowing behind her, and she has her newborn baby, which in Colleen was the little girl standing to her side. Colleen is actually a representation of her several years later, a little more hardened, a little more, you know, adapted to the wilderness. Here she is standing there with her baby in her arms, her shawl, you know, enveloping not only the baby but her, and she's holding close her sunbonnet to her face, and sitting there with shoes on and all that stuff, wondering what in heaven's name am I doing here? What kind of future have I got for my daughter? It's a question that probably every pioneer asked themselves when they finally got out to the Golden West, which wasn't, after all, golden. It was just expansive and dusty, cold, dangerous, deadly, and you either adapted or you died. So as far as coming up with the idea, it's just sometimes they take longer. This one, Michael Terry was an Indian model, and a young woman who was a Mohawk Indian, and they posed with his horse and her on the horse. He was an Indian, of course, and I had taken those pictures almost 6 years ago in Wyoming, and during a modeling session I had with him and the young lady. And then it took me that long before I actually had an idea from the photograph what to do with it. And it's one that I always liked, the idea of having the man and the woman together on horseback, or the woman on horseback and the man standing next to her. And so that's how long it took. And she's just barely got a expansive stomach here, showing that she's pregnant. I didn't want to overdo it, because then it gets ridiculous looking. You still have to sell bronze. Now, as far as keeping in mind what the foundry will charge you, everything that you do to a sculpture, every undercut, every little fringe or whatever, I don't know what you would plan to sculpt, but every little detail, even down to the little fur here, all that texture takes time to clean the mold material out of on the bronze. And so you've got to be mindful that whatever detail you put into something, they've got to get the mold completely out. So what I do is I fill in underneath so that the mold comes out easily. You don't have to have it go all the way up to her arm. Up here you can just fill it in down to there and nobody would even know, because it's an illusion. The sculpture is just illusion anyway. Something this size and as complicated as it's going to be, it's probably going to be $1,800 to $2,100 to cast. And the mold cost is going to be close to the same, because it's a one-time cost. They have to cut all this apart and make molds of all the different parts, and it's all made out of latex rubber and with a plaster or fiberglass shell over the latex rubber. Latex is very expensive, and their time is expensive, and it takes probably several weeks to make a mold of something this size. Now, if I was just to do a bust of him from, like, say, the waist up to there, with nothing more than what's right there, it probably costs a couple $100, maybe $300 or $400 to cast it. But when I start putting hair on it and hat and clothing on it, then the costs go dramatically up. And something that size, from, let's say, from there with no arms, with fringe and hair and some kind of hat and maybe even a beard, could cost anywhere from $800 to $600 to $800 to cast. And I'm just giving you what the local foundry here charges me, and I'm just guessing. And usually my guess is pretty close. What they also do is they, like, for instance, if there was a bust of her with her clothing the way it is, it would probably be $600 to $700, maybe $800 to cast that, because they have to cast these little braids separately. They have to cut them off and cast them separately. All these little dangly things, they'll just probably cut that whole arm off right there and cast that as a separate mold. So you always got to keep in mind what it's going to cost to cast. The horse, if it was to be cast by itself with nothing on its back or anything like that, would probably be $1,200, $1,500 to cast, because of the size and the amount of bronze that they would have to use. Bronze, also, I found this last year, we were charged an extra $10 or 15 or 20 bucks per pound of bronze as a surcharge for the copper in it, because copper is really expensive. This piece will probably weigh anywhere from 60 to 70 to 80 pounds, and the casting itself is only maybe 1/8 of an inch thick. The bronze itself, this is all hollow when they cast it. The only solid parts would be like the arm and little narrow places where they can't make it hollow. The legs would be probably solid. The base would be hollow. So there's a lot of cost going on there. Like I said, $2,100 to $2,500 for casting of something like this. I usually multiply my first copies, the cost of producing it, and that's only the $2,500. You can't include the cost of the mold. I usually used to multiply that by 5, whatever it cost me to produce it, because you still have to pay the foundry 40% or 50% of what they sell it for, maybe even as low as 30%. And then out of your 70 to 50% amount of money that you get back, you've got to pay for not only the casting and the mold, but you've got to pay for the shipping to the foundry.